Hi there, welcome to Woodlands. My name's Peter, and we're just going to look at the Passover passage now that we're covering in cell groups. So this reading's from Exodus 12, verses 1 to 13, and then jumping forward a bit to 29 to 32. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month every man shall take a lamb according to their fathers' houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbour shall take according to the number of persons. According to what each can eat, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they will eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat any of it raw, or boiled in water, but roasted, its head with its legs and its inner parts. And you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover, for I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." At midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn from the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, "Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go. Serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." Quite a long reading, but one that we're all no doubt quite familiar with. This is the story of the first Passover, the 10th and final plague to hit Egypt. After Pharaoh had disobeyed God's command to release the Israelites from captivity, despite seeing God's power displayed in 9 other plagues of escalating devastation on the land and on his people, this is the one that finally broke him. But before we look at this one, how did we get here? What led us to this moment, to such a severe plague, and what is the significance of the supper itself? The book of Exodus picks up right where Genesis leaves off. At the end of Genesis, we've got Jacob and his sons settling in Egypt, where God has placed Joseph and blessed him so that both the children of promise and the nation of Egypt can survive a famine that's going to hit the land. At the start of Exodus, Jacob, Joseph, and that entire generation are all dead, but their descendants have greatly multiplied in the land of Egypt. God's promise to Abraham has surely been kept. Yet all is not well for this nation. The new king in Egypt, he doesn't care for them. He doesn't care about the legacy of Joseph in leading them through the famine. This Pharaoh turns them into slaves because he's scared that if a war breaks out, these Israelites could be a threat. And he feels so threatened that he even commands the Hebrew midwives to kill the male Hebrew children at birth. Now, we know the names of 2 of these midwives anyway, Shiphrah and Puah, extremely important women in Jewish cultural history. And the Bible tells us that they feared God, and they wouldn't do what Pharaoh said. Instead, They let the boys live, and when they were questioned on this, they say to Pharaoh's face, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive." So after this point, we get the early life of Moses, and some other stuff happens that we're going to skip over at this time. We're just going to say we get to this point where Moses has brought God's command to Pharaoh in Egypt, saying, "Let the Israelites go," and Pharaoh says no. At this point, we get a lot of plagues. And some scholars have even suggested that each plague hits out at a specific Egyptian god. They have a god of the Nile. God turns the Nile to blood. The Egyptians have a god of storms and disorder. God sends a plague of locusts to devour the land. The Egyptians have a god of the sun called Ra. God engulfs the land in darkness for 3 days. Somehow, Pharaoh sees all of these plagues, and he still doesn't want to obey God's command to let the Israelites go. And that's where we come to this bit of our passage. And God tells Moses and Aaron how they are to prepare for the coming Passover. Now, the Passover supper itself, still honoured by Jews today, is a celebration of Israel's deliverance from Egypt, and it's a reminder of God's people and the time that they were freed from slavery and his promise keeping in that. To be spared from death, they had to kill a lamb without defect. They had to put its blood over the front door and stay in. Why was this lamb important? Because by killing the lamb, the Israelites were shedding innocent blood. The lamb was a substitute for somebody who should have died in this plague. There were firstborn in those Israelite homes. They should have died that night, but because the lamb had been killed in their place, God passed over the houses and spared the firstborn within. This was an important lesson for the Israelites. To be spared from death, an innocent life must be sacrificed in your place. It's a lesson in God's holiness and the requirements of his justice, as much as it is a lesson in his mercy, in that he will accept a sacrifice in the first place. But it wasn't just the death of the lamb and the blood on the doorpost that these Israelites had to do. They had to eat the lamb as well. They were commanded to eat the whole animal and leave nothing left. Any leftovers were to be burned. The lamb was to be roasted and consumed with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Even the bread and the herbs and the dress code have a meaning here. Pharaoh is about to relent and free the Israelites, but it's going to be a snap decision that he goes back on. Exodus 14 verse 5 reads, "Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them," that's the slaves, "and said, 'What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services.'" So the purpose of making the bread without yeast was that it could be made quickly. The dough doesn't need to rise, so the Israelites would be ready to make a quick exit. And the bitter herbs represent the bitterness of the Israelites' time of slavery in Egypt. And also the instructions of how the meal's to be eaten in verse 11. "In this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste." The Israelites were told to be dressed ready to leave at a moment's notice as they were eating this. And they had to eat quickly. Everything about the preparation and consumption of this meal was about speed. Get out of Egypt before Pharaoh changes his mind. But the readiness for travel was also a sign of their faith in God. They trusted him to deliver them from Egypt. They were ready to go because they expected to be let go. They were not free during the time that they ate this meal, but they trusted in God's promise to free them and to lead them out of Egypt. So this action, just being dressed and ready to go while eating the meal, was a demonstration of faith in God. Not so for Pharaoh and for the Egyptian people. Earlier we thought about how the plagues that God sends against Egypt are direct challenges to the Egyptian gods. So if you know anything about Egyptian gods, you're maybe thinking that when it comes to the death of the firstborn, this could be a challenge to their god of death, Anubis. Maybe there's an argument for that, but that's not quite what's going on here. There is another Egyptian god that this plague hits out at, one with even greater significance. The Egyptians worshipped Pharaoh as a god. They thought him the greatest of gods. They believed that Pharaoh was the son of the god Ra, manifested in human flesh. Pharaoh is the ultimate power in Egypt. Exodus 12:29 tells us, at midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon. By taking away Pharaoh's firstborn son, God was attacking the top of the hierarchy of Egyptian gods, taking away the heir to the throne of Egypt. And there wasn't really anywhere to go from that. There's no need for an 11th plague, because nothing could be worse than this. The death of the firstborn, the plague that finally broke Pharaoh and moved him to obey God's command and release the Israelites. And we see that it wasn't just within Pharaoh's household either. It was the whole of Egypt. Every family in Egypt suffered a loss. And this event goes just beyond grieving families. It devastated the entire Egyptian culture. Egyptian society was ruled by what we would nowadays call a primogenitor, and that's just a fancy word that means the firstborn has authority in the family unit. So, going after the firstborn here was a polemic on Egyptian society as a whole. The eldest ruled all the younger siblings. And that's actually something that scholars say have made the Israelites so important to Egypt as slaves. Having slaves gave the lower classes someone else to dominate. And this is what some Jewish scholars have said that the song of Moses and Miriam in Exodus 15 is about. I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and rider he has hurled into the sea. And this motif of a horse and a rider being cast into the sea, it's a recurring theme in this song. The Jewish scholar Netziv suggests that it encapsulates the defeat of Egypt. As the rider rides on the subjugated horse, so the rider has to listen to the officer has to listen to the general has to listen to the commander-in-chief, and so on. And it's a depiction of the horrors of Egyptian society. It's a series of horse and riders where the Jewish slaves were the lowest horse in the hierarchy, but they also supported the whole structure. And this, Netziv says, is why the Egyptians were loath to release their slaves, because society would crumble without them. It puts the death of the firstborn in a new light. It explains why it is so essential to the Exodus. The horse and rider philosophy sunk in the sea. The death of the firstborn was the beginning of the final chapter of liberation, where the leading riders were the first ones to die. But what about us today? How are we to read this chapter of Israelite history? Well, it's important for us because this is really the start of one of the most important theological themes that we can read in the entire Bible. The Passover might have been the final chapter in the Israelites' redemption or freedom from Egypt, but it was the first chapter in the story of what we call redemption history. Redemption's kind of a big deal. Adam sinned. We inherited that sin. As sinners, we must be redeemed. Otherwise, we are destined for an eternity without God. Since the fall of man, the human race has been in need of redemption because in its sinful state, it can have no place in God's kingdom. And God, being holy, can give sin no quarter. But God is rich in mercy, and he gives us a second chance. Enter the subject of redemption history. It can also be called salvation history. And this is the history of how man's means of redemption has changed throughout the times. The redemption of sinful man requires a sacrifice, but not just any sacrifice will do. The Passover has shown us that God's justice demands that innocent blood be shed, because the only just punishment for sin is death. The Passover was an awesome display of God's power and his mercy to his people. It gave them a way to be saved at that time. But the Passover did not deal with the problem of sin. The sacrifice of the lamb saved the Israelites from physical death, but not spiritual death. Spiritual death was a much bigger problem. It wouldn't have done that much good for the Israelites to survive Passover, get out of Egypt, make it to the promised land, settle there, and then upon death be condemned to an eternity in hell. And today we face the same punishment of eternity without God because of the problem of indwelling sin, which all man suffers from. Ephesians 2 verse 3 tells us that we are children of wrath, just like the rest of the world, and we indulge in the desires of our flesh and mind. Passover doesn't save anyone from that, but it is the starting point in redemption history, and it points to the ultimate solution to sin that would later come. Redemption history has its next big development in Exodus 20, when the Ten Commandments were introduced. But as Paul tells us, those rules didn't save anyone either. Romans 3 verse 20, for by works of the law no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. In other words, rather than helping us deal with our sin, the Ten Commandments only showed us how sinful we were. And it showed us the level of holiness that God requires. And we were forever helpless to meet that by ourselves. Our works couldn't save us because they would just be the works of a sinner. Psalm 51 verse 5 says, surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. And it's that indwelling sin that makes all of our efforts fruitless. God knew this at the time he gave these commandments. But in the spirit of Passover, he provided a means by which the Israelites could temporarily make amends for their sin, making sacrifices. The sacrifices detailed in the book of Leviticus meant that something else would experience death so that you didn't have to. Leviticus 17:11 says, for the life of a creature is in its blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. That's the key. Life is required to give life back to the spiritually dead. For your sins to be forgiven, innocent blood must be shed. The problem was that these sacrifices were only a temporary solution. The sacrificial system, whilst better than nothing, was not sufficient for us because of this same problem of our indwelling sin. You might argue, well, if I could just stop sinning completely and never mess up again, wouldn't that be all right? History has shown us that man just can't do that. And you would still have the problem of the indwelling sin, the one that starts it all. As long as that's there, we stand condemned no matter how many good works we do. The problem with these animal sacrifices in Leviticus, why they were temporary, is that even though they were innocent, they were not perfect. We needed a perfect sacrifice to free us from our indwelling sin. And in the final chapter in redemption history, we get that in Jesus. 2 Corinthians 5:21 reads, for our sake he, that is God, made him, that is Jesus, to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. In other words, Jesus took on our sin. Perfect Jesus lifted up the sin of imperfect man and took it on himself to deal with it in a once and for all time sacrifice that saved us from the death we should have died and gives us eternal life in him. And that means that our problem of indwelling sin is dealt with. No more temporary sacrifices. No more condemnation through the law. No more slavery to sin. The final sacrifice has been made, and it is sufficient for all. We know that Christ has taken our sin to become our sacrifice because he tells us so in Luke 22, verses 19 to 20, the Last Supper. And he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And likewise the cup after he had eaten, saying, this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. How fitting it is that Jesus gives us the new promise during the Passover meal that he shared with the disciples. The remembrance meal from that first chapter in redemption history, which he comes to fulfill. The unleavened bread represented his body, sinless and perfect, that was broken on the cross. And the wine represented his blood, the blood of an unblemished lamb, shed for us. And with the words that he spoke, he forever links the Old Testament covenant with the New, which lasts eternally in him, because after he died, he resurrected. A perfect, eternal sacrifice that continually forgives even the sins not yet committed, because he lives to forgive us for them through the power of the death that he died for us. And as you think about Passover, the first chapter in redemption history, remember that it ultimately points to Jesus. He fulfills the requirements for our redemption through his death for us, and he eternally holds us up to God through his resurrection. Amen.